Would you all please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? Ready? I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. Moment of silence while we're standing. Wouldn't hurt. All right, thank you. We need to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
A motion by Director Days, second by Director Osborne. Any discussion from the board? Any from the public, Jen?
If members of the public would like to address the board at any public comment period during this meeting, please refer to the detailed instructions on page 2 of today's agenda. President Verkamp, does not appear there are any members of the public wishing to speak on the adoption of today's agenda, moved by Director Day and seconded by Director Osborne. I believe we're ready for the vote.
All right, I don't see anybody in the audience wanting to rush the podium, so, okay, please vote.
Division 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, voting aye. Motion carries unanimously.
All right, communications, general manager, employee recognition.
I have one today. We received an email from Debbie and Chuck Schaefer complimenting John Shavers, the collections system supervisor, and they wrote to him, "I would like to say thank you," capitalized. "I really appreciate how prompt this was addressed. This request was addressed, and the inspector I met a few days later. He was very friendly and followed up as promised." Also wrote that please let the folks know who published the waterfront, that the March and April issue was instrumental in making this happen. I'm assuming that was regarding the service lateral line information we published, so good news. And then I'll have 2 reports later on.
Very good. Thank you very much for that. Communications, public comment. Any public comment? Seeing none again from the room. Do we have anybody online?
This is the time to comment on any items not on today's agenda. If members of the public would like to address the board at any public comment period during this meeting, please refer to the detailed instructions on page 2 of today's agenda. President Verkamp, it does not appear there are any members of the public wishing to speak.
All right, thank you. Communications, general manager, Jim.
I have 2 reports today. The first one, I think Brian Mueller is going to take the lead, and maybe Dan will pop in regarding the water loss reduction from the upper main ditch piping project.
Good morning, Brian.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, we just wanted to report on some of the benefits received from the new pipeline that was installed last year from Four Bay Reservoir to the Reservoir 1 water treatment plant that replaced the old upper main ditch conveyance. The project was completed sometime last spring, around March, April of last year. And if you recall, during the development of that project, the district developed a calculation of water losses that were experienced by operation of the old ditch. We have like a lookup table, so based on different flow rates and different seasons that we were diverting, we were able to estimate and calculate the amount of losses. And those losses, they ranged up to about 2,000 acre feet. On average, it was about 1,800 acre feet of losses that we had calculated. So for 2022, we had a bit of a condensed operational period. It was sandwiched between the Caldor fire recovery. The flumes came back online around May of last year, and then we were taken offline with the regular fall outage in October. So the operational period for the main ditch pipeline was between May 10th and October 26th of last year. And we calculated those losses to be a little over 1,100 acre feet for 2022. So that's a great benefit in itself. Also wanted to mention one of the other objectives of that pipeline was to improve source water quality. That really proved beneficial with the New Year's storms, where we had all the water quality issues at Jenkinson Lake, we were able to bring Reservoir One water treatment plant online. The 4-bay reservoir in that pipeline had improved water quality compared with Jenkinson Lake. So we were able to bring Reservoir One online temporarily until Jenkinson Lake water quality improves. So that's another benefit with that pipeline as well that we just experienced recently.
Brian, how did they, upper and lower main ditch handle the heavy deluge, you know? Because I know in the past we've had some questions about their flooding or causing issues. I mean, I didn't hear anything, so I'm presuming
Yeah,
good.
we didn't hear of any issues at all. There's no overflows or anything like that.
Good.
Great.
And Dan, I think you have the presentation.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning, Dan.
Dan likes to have these little things handed out as a small token.
Good morning. No acorns today. President Camp members of the board, good morning. Whenever we have a notable milestone with the district, we like to just capitalize and have a little token to recognize this major achievement. So you, board may recall, at least those members on the board, we did our first water transfer. We took that advantage of that opportunity to take a small portion of that water from Weber Creek. So what we did this time was on the first day of operation of Res 1 through the new pipeline, your now retired drinking water operations manager, Radenko Adzakovic himself, collected the first water to ever flow through that ditch to our treatment plant. So what we have for you is just a small little token, obviously very nominal cost. This is the actual water that went through the main ditch pipeline on May 11th, 2022.
Oh my God, I have water from a guru.
Don't drink that.
Yeah, it's untreated.
Raw water, yes, so not treated.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. It's very nice.
Guru husband.
Doesn't mix
It
with
doesn't
Scotch.
dehydrate either.
Probably.
This is cool.
Thank you, Dan. And
Thank
thank
you,
you,
Dan.
Brian.
It's interesting, yesterday I was at a football party and ran into Chuck Vanderpool, who was very, very cordial meeting, and he just said, the trees on the side of the ditch are dying. And I said, well, you know, it's gonna happen. But anyway, he was one of the very vocal people on that ditch issue, so. But we parted very cordial and said we're glad to see each other, and we just were on the opposite side of an issue, so.
And I just wanted to, I do obviously have a few additional bottles. I can't bring the entire staff team down here, but while Brian and I are talking this morning, it's really important to recognize this was an immense effort from our legal folks, our environmental folks, our project engineer, Kaylee, our construction inspector. So it was definitely a major team effort and a major milestone that's already paid dividends, both long-term for our conservation strategy as well as a major benefit during those extreme conditions during the storm. So I want to just make sure we're not remiss in recognizing everybody contributed to this effort.
Do I boil it before I drink it?
Do not drink this. This is simply a memento.
And Director Rankin.
Yeah, but just, you said 2,000 acre feet? That's what we're doing?
This
We're
year,
saving?
this year we saved 1,100 on average. It's about 1,800 acre feet a year, depending upon how
So the
long that.
talking point is 1,800.
Yes, that's our average. Exactly.
Okay, perfect, thanks.
Yes, I have up on my shelf the last one we did, which I think was the first water sale, right?
Exactly, in
Well,
2015.
and it'd be interesting to see what happens. A tiny strand of algae grew in there
Right.
and stopped, and it just sits there in this little tiny green thing. Didn't turn the rest of it green.
Right.
So I'm curious to see what happens here.
That would be a side-by-side source water comparison, the upper watershed versus
Right,
Weber.
exactly.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Dan. All right.
And President Veerkamp, we had one more presentation. As we briefed the board, we had a couple outages on the Diamond Springs transmission main. And Patrick's going to share with you what the impacts were and the causes. So Patrick?
Good morning, members of the board. Patrick Wilson, Drinking Water Manager, here to give you a little bit of background on the two recent transmission outages that we've experienced on the Diamond Springs main. Next slide, please. So the initial leak occurred on February 2nd. And it was actually on a blow-off appurtenance attached to the pipeline. So just to give you a little bit of background, Diamond Springs, Maine, of course, was built in 1961. Original construction by the Bureau of Reclamation. Took treated water from Reservoir 7 water treatment plant at that time, distributed it down to Cameron Park by way Reservoir 12 area, which is kind of above Bel Air, just for reference in Cameron Park Drive. This break occurred just on the other side of Ponderosa Road in between Reservoir 12. It actually occurred on a standpipe, as you can see there on the right photo. A seam failure on that pipeline, which is a normal occurrence, unfortunately, on that ductile iron pipe spool when the coating fails. So we have, I did a little bit of a count on the transmission lines that are constructed this way. We have a total of 66 of these in the system, of which on the Diamond Springs main we have 24. That construction actually has the isolation valve at the top, as you can see there, and doesn't have it attached to the transmission main. So current construction practices install that on the transmission main so that the blow-off itself, if there is ever a leak, does not require a transmission main shutdown to make a repair. Obviously, in this case, with the location of that isolation valve, it did require a transmission line shutdown. The Diamond Springs main was originally constructed with pressure-reducing stations, which subsequently from Reservoir 7, originally Reservoir 8, and then subsequently Reservoir 9, and then finalizing at Reservoir 12. Those stations were really the only isolation outside of one mainline insulation valve that was put in under a construction project back in the late 80s, which is right around Highway 50. We call it the Highway 50 vault. We call it the Highway 50 isolation. That valve is actually within a vault. That is the only valve that we have to isolate the Diamond Springs main outside of the pressure-reducing stations, which have inherent isolation within them. That valve was used on this outage and subsequently required a shutdown of Ponderosa High School, which we were in direct contact with, in addition to another approximately 180 customers. That shutdown was interlaced with some challenges, obviously, with the water jetting the way that it was. It was determined that we needed to make this shutdown much sooner than we had anticipated when we arrived on site. Communicating with the school as well, we were able to come to an agreement on a shutdown for this particular endeavor it's February 2nd, so Thursday of that week. Next slide, please.
Patrick, before you move on.
Sure.
You talked about the isolation valve in the vault at roughly, isn't it Highway 50 and Ponderosa about where that is?
It's on the other side. So the Diamond Springs main kind of runs along Mudload for the majority of it, and then it actually crosses Highway 50 before the toy shop is kind of the best road reference I can give you. Where the billboard's there, it actually cuts across in that open yard and then cuts across North Shingle through the backyards, subsequently where this pipeline is, and runs kind of basically parallel with Highway 50 at that point until it terminates at
It
Reservoir.
seems like about a year ago, I think on New Year's Day or New Year's Eve, didn't we have a major leak right there?
Yeah, we had it North Shingle, absolutely, and I was going to get to that on my next slide.
Sorry.
No, it's all good, Director Dwyer. We'll get there. Yeah, if we could just go to the next slide, please, Jen. So February 2nd was the Thursday. Subsequently, that following Tuesday, we recognized, as I somewhat mentioned, between Reservoir 9 and Reservoir 12, we noticed a low pressure as well as Reservoir 9 draining, which subsequently told us that we had some sort of break in the pipeline. Along that pipeline, there are many turnouts. Adjacent to the backhoe there, you can kind of see a concrete structure. That's one of the pressure-reducing stations that's along the pipeline. That station, there are 3 required in this shutdown. They require isolation as well as the former shutdown that we just spoke about. Those are turnouts to other customers. Luckily, with that turnout, there's other ways to feed those customers. It's not a sole turnout. However, customers that are directly tapped, like Ponderosa High School off the transmission line, are subsequent to an outage, including those 180 customers. This repair, unfortunately, a little bit different than the last one, which was requiring just a replacement of a small spool section of 4-inch in nature. This was actually a leak on the 16-inch line. This is a very strange leak for EID. Traditionally, what we normally see is a failure of the outside concrete on the pipeline, which allows groundwater to get in and corrode the outside of that steel cylinder on the outside of that pipeline. However, in this case, next slide, please, Jen. In this case, it was an internal corrosion that had occurred most likely from a failed installation. The greatest challenge, I would argue, in installation of any of these concrete pipelines is really the actual bedding of the pipeline. So the bedding of the pipeline consists of essentially the grounding for the pipeline, placement of the pipeline, and then backfill of that pipeline. What subsequently happened in 1961, not only with the Diamond Springs main, but as well as EDM1, El Dorado main number 1, both of those pipelines, for the majority of those installations, were backfilled and native. The leak that Director Dwyer was speaking about from last year that we did come across was actually a failure of the outside of that concrete mortar from a rock that was sitting on top of that pipeline from original installation that caused a crack in the mortar. This instance is kind of a subject inverse of that in a way, because it's actually a failure of the mortar inside the pipeline. That mortar failed most likely from either installation or poor construction poor application at the facility at the time. It's a little bit difficult to see on that photo on the left, and I did my best to try to clean it up, but there's a bunch of mud obviously shown on that. That steel cylinder was pristine. It looked like it was brand new. As far as the bar wrap, additionally brand new. So that led us to believe that the internal corrosion had occurred on the backside. And in looking in that location there, we were able to see actually corrosion on the backside of that steel cylinder, indicating that water had been sitting on there for a prolonged period of time. Much is the challenge with this pipeline and really all of our transmission lines. We only know what we know and what we can see. So much in line with what we're doing with El Dorado main number 2, the Diamond Springs main will be under an assessment in the coming years as part of the capital improvement project to try to get in and see what else is in this pipeline. Obviously, this steel cylinder outside of that looked great. Photos upstream and downstream all looked wonderful, but there's no guarantee that another 40 feet away that we don't have a problem brewing. So as part of that El Dorado main number 2 project, we're in the process currently today of actually installing the camera within the pipeline and trying to get in there. We had some challenges with that, which we'll talk about on our update to that project, but it's really going to help us kind of see what's inside the pipeline, as well as a corrosion assessment of the external of that pipeline to see where we may have mortar failure on the outside as well that may be leading to some external future leaks there. But that's kind of the antithesis of the 2 repairs that we had. Are there any questions?
Yep, Director Osborne.
You said that pipeline was put in the 60s? So I think it's appropriate that people know that that line is 70-some years old. And I actually watched it being built, But, no, but I think it's important for the public to understand, we've got miles of this pipes that are 60, 70 years old that we just have to fix, over a planned you know what I'm saying? We got to get these damn things fixed, or because the cost of repairing it is far superior to doing it on a planned basis.
Right. Director Dwyer? I'm sorry.
Patrick, it seems coincidental that these leaks or failures occurred so close together. And not understanding the hydraulics of the situation, but when we shut down for the first repair, isn't there some kind of hammering that if you don't do it very, very carefully, that spreads out throughout the system? Do you think there was any relationship to our shutdown to this second failure, if you get my drift?
Absolutely. Nice, nice. I see what you did there with the drift. Good job. So to answer your question, I do think they are related, but not from a water hammer scenario on a restore. So I'll kind of back up a little bit on that. So on the restore side of it, with that vault at Highway 50, with that isolation valve, it is a very slow restore to it. as well as an open reservoir on the backside. So Reservoir 12 is downstream and Reservoir 9 is upstream. So in the event that there was potentially a fast restore, there's a place for that water to exhaust itself in either Reservoir 12 or Reservoir 9. So I don't actually think that had any play in it. I think the main issue is anytime we dewater these pipelines, whether it's outside diameter steel or really any of these concrete pipes, we run the risk of finding a secondary leak at some point because you relieve that stress, that pressure, keeping all that intact. So this particular pipe and this location where it leaked is a composite structure. So you have a mortar lining, steel cylinder, bar wrap, concrete on the outside. It has to work in unison in order for it to adequately adhere to the pressures that it's exposed to. That failure, to me, speaks that it just was the right amount of time that potentially that mortar lifted out of that location on the restore, went down the pipeline, leak occurred. More than likely. The restore itself, I highly doubt that had any occurrence on causing that leak.
Thank you.
Yes, Director Day?
Yeah, Patrick, how long was Ponderosa without service, and what did they do and you do to accommodate the students?
So they actually did an early release in both occurrences on those. I believe the first one was 11:30. They might have been subsequently around the same time on that Tuesday. They also had after-school events, so they worked with the fire marshal in order to adequately continue to hold those events. We worked on the secondary event to actually provide hand washing stations during the duration of the time that they were there. One of the challenges that they have is that they have no secondary source. We will be meeting with the school in the next hopefully coming weeks to kind of have an after-action discussion about what challenges we experience, what they experience, to try to help both of us mitigate this in any way that we can do. The biggest struggle that we have, as I kind of mentioned, is they kind of have a single point of connection to the Diamond Springs main. They also have a secondary connection for their fire system, so that's what allowed them to stay actually in operation during the basketball game. I believe they had some other events going on Tuesday night. But with the operation of that system, it's not really an option to kind of add in another backflow and make all that work. So we're going to meet with them, see if there's any options that we can try to work together on going forward to help mitigate some of the outages. As may kind of be said, Diamond Springs, Maine, we've averaged about a leak a year, and it's getting progressively worse, in my opinion, from the failures that we're seeing, especially one like this that was not a really common leak repair that we're traditionally used to seeing in terms of the failure point. That part's obviously alarming. I have a bad feeling, unfortunately, that these repairs are just going to continue, especially
Patrick,
in that section.
I'm sorry, I have to cut you off, but if we're going further with this, we really need to agendize this as a future information item
Okay.
to stay in line with the Brown Act requirements. I appreciate the update, and I'm sure we all do, and obviously breaks are unexpected, but just to stay in compliance with the Brown Act, we can bring this back as an information item later if the board chooses, and we need to go ahead and move on. I apologize.
Yeah, and I would just comment, I would like to see it agendized and maybe something relative to that secondary access. As you know, my wife's on the high school board. I heard about it a couple different times. Again, so there is a cost to them every time they shut the school down, and very important. And I appreciate what we did to try the events going, but let's agendize and talk about it and see if there's something else that we can do to keep them operating. So appreciate it very much.
Absolutely.
Jen, thank you for that. We're getting a little bit
Thank you, Patrick.
into the project, potential project. So don't want to preclude or make an issue there. All right, anything else, Jim, under your report?
No, I'm done, thank you.
All right, clerk of the board, Jen?
None today, thank you.
All right, board of directors, anybody? Yes, Director Anzini.
Just a quick report, I'm now treasurer of the Mountain County Water District, or Mountain County Water Areas Resources, whatever.
Mountain Counties Water
Water Resource
Resources Association.
Association now. Moving up the ladder, I guess. I was the only one who put my hand up, so we'll see.
Very, very good. Anything else? I'll report briefly, we had a LAFCO meeting on the 25th. We appointed officers, we appointed committee members, and we had a mid-year budget update, and all is well at LAFCO and getting things done, so. That's it. Our next meeting is the 23rd of this month, February, moving forward. All right, any, nothing else from the directors? Okay, approval consent calendar.
Move it.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any input from the public in the audience? Seeing none. Jen, how about from anybody online?
If members of the board would like to address the public, this is the time to make a comment for approval of the consent calendar, moved by Director Osborne and seconded by Director Anzini. President Veerkamp, it does not appear there are any members of the public wishing to speak on the approval of the consent calendar. I believe we're ready for the vote.
Yes, please, everybody vote.
Division 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, voting aye, motion carries unanimously.
Information items, item 5, operations and engineering. Patrick?
You can talk as long as you want on this one.
Are you sure? I don't want to put him to sleep.
Absolutely.
Good morning. Patrick Wilson, Drinking Water Operations Manager. I'm here today to present the condition of storage reservoirs and tanks overview informational item today. Next slide, please. So just a brief overview of the presentation outline. Be talking about all tanks in the district, all storage infrastructure, of which the words are pretty interchangeable, just to be clear in this, whether it's clear well or tank or reservoir, just to be upfront. Not only water, but also wastewater and recycled water. A little bit of a technical analysis of the failure modes. The current preventative maintenance, our cycles, and what we're doing to try to mitigate some of these challenges, and the current and past capital improvement plans, and kind of a little bit of a look ahead for you. Next slide, please. So the summary of the district storage, as you can see, overwhelmingly, we have, including the welded tank with aluminum dome, we have 32 welded tanks in the system. We also have, obviously, the 6 bolted tanks. 2 of those are bolted with fiberglass liners in them. I'll get into that in a little bit later. We have 5 concrete tanks and reservoirs, and then 7 Hypalon line and covered reservoirs, better known as floating cover reservoirs for everyone here. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of an overview to show, really we're kind of spread out everywhere from Strawberry all the way down to the county line with storage, not just in drinking water, but parsed in there with wastewater shown in green and recycled shown in purple. Next slide, please. Welded storage tanks, as I mentioned, we have 32 in total. They do range in age from 13 to 63 years. The average life cycle, if coated every 15 years, the anticipated life cycle is 75, upwards of 100, depending on original construction material and selection of steel. 16 of those were constructed between 2000 and 2006. A lot of that had to do with the 1998 compliance order for open reservoirs. Obviously, getting away from that in the most cost-effective way was to install welded storage tanks. As I'll get to a little bit later, there's some challenges with that, obviously, and some cost implications now that we have challenges with, obviously. The industry standard, and part of that challenge is to recoat every 15 years. That helps to maintain that structure and to mitigate the corrosion aspects of it. District has not consistently met the standard, which I'll get to in a little bit. We do perform dive inspections and cleaning every 5 years, and we have consistently met this standard. One of the main things with that diving and that inspection that does give us is a routine, not only just the video, so we can kind of backlog and look at previous videos, but we can also kind of see any major changes, and I'll get into one of those in a little bit later as well. Next slide, please. So just a brief recoating history. So we started back in 2012 with Salmon Falls Tank, and we were averaging about 1 a year. With the staffing changeover, we had a little bit of a break. due to retirement, and then in 2018, we picked back up again, and subsequently 2022 and 2023. You know, one of the main struggles with this, obviously, not just as a staffing challenge from a resource standpoint, obviously having 16 welded storage tanks built in 1 year makes it very difficult to recoat those. You'd average 2.5 or so a year to recoat in order to stay on that same time frame. But it also lends to some of the financial challenges, obviously, that we have with trying to adequately fund this and maintain these reservoirs and tanks as we move forward. So part of that challenge, back in 2011, this was presented to the board. I was pulled from a presentation that a previous engineer had put together, Bob Rice. And he'd kind of simply drawn out the original construction date, which is shown in the light blue, with a line diagramming out where the 15-year life cycle would be for the coating, and the recoating window of where that would be. Since 2011, between 2011 and 2023, there should have been 15 tanks that were recoated. The district, however, performed 5. Again, a lot of that funding related and staffing related challenges. And again, part of it is original construction. You know, we adhered to owning 16 of these in a very short period of time, and trying to space those out in adequate and manageable chunks so that we can recoat it has been a challenge. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So Reservoir 3, just to go back in time a little bit, and I would like you to try to remember this photo for a later slide in this PowerPoint. For Reservoir 3, we had some failures, obviously, of the coating. The lamination of the coating is politely put, obviously on the roof as well as the steel structure inside. Next slide, please. And with that delamination, obviously the coating and steel itself fell to the floor of that tank and required, in this case, a complete rebuild of the actual roof. Next slide, please. And to elongate the life of that steel structure, we add an aluminum roof. As part of this project, we actually had to add, and it may be somewhat difficult to see in this photo, but there's actually an additional top stave, and a stave is essentially just a level, if you will, just like in a house. And that top level, which is above the overflow pipe that's actually sticking out there, was added for a multitude of reasons. One is to adhere to the installation of that aluminum dome, but also because there were repairs that were needed to be made to the actual steel structure itself. So we had to actually repair part of the original steel that was there in order to just add the aluminum dome. That aluminum dome will more than outlive the life of the remaining for that steel structure. It is a far superior product going forward, and where it's possible in the future, the district is advocating to do that on reservoirs and tanks. You know, one of the challenges that we got into, which we'll get into in a moment, is there are some limitations to the aluminum dome application. It's not a one-for-one and a one-size-fits-all. Original construction sometimes will hinder the ability to actually install that aluminum dome. So the larger the diameter, the more challenging that becomes, more costly it becomes for that matter.
Patrick, isn't there some, if you back up one, isn't there some public relations challenges with doing the aluminum dome in terms of aesthetics and reflection, and I think that's nicknamed Jiffy Pop.
It is.
Isn't it?
It
Okay,
is.
thank you.
It's the one you like.
It is the one I like. That's fair. You're absolutely right, Director Dwyer, and part of the public outreach for it going forward will be significantly improved from what I experienced with that project, and I'll be honest there. A lot of that reflection, that initial comment. So with the construction of that at the factory, these can actually come out pre-brazed, and one of the original specifications for that project did not have that in there. After one acid rain winter, the reflection is completely gone. So we used to be able to see some reflection on this on Carson Road, just to kind of give you the full picture of that. That was the initial complaint, obviously. After the first winter, gone. And in fact, when you drive by that now, you'll barely even notice it. It's kind of fallen back in terms of it's fallen very well oxidized, if it's a polite way to say that. And I think that going forward, having that outreach and having that communication, and frankly, having this in service will also help to kind of show someone, hey, take a drive down Carson Road if you're really interested in seeing what's going to be in your side yard, that kind of thing. It'll really kind of help us moving forward with that communication, absolutely. So I'd mentioned, obviously Reservoir 3 with the coating failure, Reservoir 2, which we're all pretty familiar with most recently from a recoating perspective. You know, this structure itself, obviously the coating failure occurred long before we ever got there to actually perform the recoat. And this one initially, so that's Reservoir 2A in the background there, and then we're standing on Reservoir 2 itself. That external failure was actually not the worst part, as the board may recall, of that structure. Reservoir 2A, next slide, please, had internal delamination on the steel I-beams that required full replacement of about 36 inner I-beams, as well as a handful of middle and outer I-beams, as well as a recoating of the inside of that structure. However, Reservoir 2, next slide, please.
Wait a minute, before you go
Yeah.
on, back up one again, please. That knife has cost this district a lot of money. And so,
Oh, no.
as an effort to save some money, I brought you a ruler.
All right.
That, number one, it shows up better in the photos, but it also will accurately describe the situation. And you can cut that in half so it'll fit in your pocket protector there, your engineer pocket.
It's the,
Thank you.
it's the right color for the
Much
day
appreciated.
tomorrow, right?
So we had to zoom in to see.
Yeah,
the
that's,
Right, what is this?
so Reservoir 2, unlike Reservoir 2A, did not fare nearly as well as, obviously, you know, as can be seen here, required a full roof replacement, as well as all of the I-beams, and most of the support structure had to be completely reworked. And part of that struggle, obviously, is the fact of the initial coating on the structure is key. And frankly, even recoating is obviously key for that matter. You know, if you don't have the adequate inspection, you don't adhere to the specifications well enough, there are consequences for that, obviously, and the district was forced to deal with that here at Reservoir 2. Next slide, please. And with that, a completed project, obviously with the intent of, and the recoating window of being every 15 years. This is actually Reservoir 2 only. You know, that roof, that structure will be maintained and long live that structure, the remainder of the bottom portion of the structure that was not replaced. And I've referenced the aluminum dome conversation that does go on, and we did actually have it during this review process where we move forward with the steel replacement. Due to the diameter of this reservoir, it was going to be very costly in order to retrofit it. The initial foundation and that design was not really privy to the removal of that roof. There was a lot of structural components that were tied together to make that structure stay upright. So with this project, we replaced it obviously in kind, but the significant difference that we have done now as opposed to the original construction efforts is we did coat the top flanges of all those I-beams, which led to the initial corrosion, right? The roof is free-floating, it moves across those I-beams. That coating is really the only thing you have to kind of save it. And without that, it was just rubbing through and creating extensive corrosion initially just from original construction.
I have a question. Okay, now that you've redone that, what's the warranty on this?
There's still only a 1-year warranty on recoating.
Okay, but how long is this how long is it gonna last?
So every recoating is 15 years. Yeah.
For sure. So
There's
we
no
can't.
for sure, though.
Okay. I know
not
you
to cut off.
previously said
Yeah.
one did not last that long, so.
Correct, absolutely. So that's the biggest struggle with concrete, with welded steel reservoirs as opposed to concrete is what I was trying to say. With welded steel, there is so many options for recoating. There's so many options for failures, challenges with those. So it can be anything from simple paint adherence to dehumidification not properly working in the day of application to, restore going in terms of the actual off-gassing of the paint may not occur adequately. There's a lot of what-ifs that go online with that. However, in terms of coating application, adherence to specifications, and mitigating those potential risks, these reservoirs, as well as the ones that we're doing going forward, are adhered much more stringently than they were from the original construction. I will not tell you that any coating is bulletproof. I won't. I will tell you concrete's near bulletproof, but I won't tell you that any sort of coating is bulletproof. But we did everything to mitigate and will continue to do so to mitigate all those challenges going forward. They're there, and we're aware of them, as well as our coating inspectors, which we have done in my opinion, a great job since even Bob took over. We've done a great job of having that conversation with them and understanding that level of detail. And we only hire those that do the greatest job for us. And obviously, you know, there's a very tight process that we go through with requests for bids for all that as well, requests for proposals, excuse me. And we do a great job of vetting that to mitigate all those risks going forward.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. So similar to Reservoir 2, but only completely different, is Bass Lake tanks, in that a very similar window that these tanks were constructed. And as you can see, this is from Bass Lake tank number 1 when we recoated it back in 2018. Very minimal rust. Next slide, please. As opposed to the complete delamination that we saw from the famed knife in the previous photos. That is really just surface rust within Bass Lake tank number 1. It's not actually corrosion to the point of full replacement or repair. And I think that's the major difference, is being able to get back with adequate coating inspection, which was performed on Bass Lake tanks, although albeit, again, the top flanges were not coated on this tank as well. But getting back to be able to recoating this and getting this into a period where we can minimize our challenges with the recoating process and minimize our repair and replacement. That's the future, and that's the goal that we're striving towards. Next slide, please. And with that recoating comes a substantially truncated project. You know, there's no steel replacement within Bass Lake tank number 1, and ideally in tank number 2 as we get into it in the next month or so. And with that, we'll be able to do a much better job of maintaining these structures and mitigating that staying on that recoating window. Next slide, please. So along that line, in the board packet, I went in a lot more detail, but I thought that this one did a great job of kind of explaining the challenges and where we're at. From the initial Reservoir 2, as I mentioned, obviously that required the full roof replacement. The project cost with change orders and the bid results, that was about $853,000 a million gallon. As opposed to Reservoir 2A, where we had some structural repair, which was replacement of a handful of I-beams, that was around $500,000 a million gallon. And if we hadn't had to do either one of those, we would have been around $386,000 per million gallon to recoat those tanks. So being able to get back to recoating those on the adequate window of every 15 years and being able to maintain that goal with sustained funding will help us to mitigate these immense costs that we take on, because not only do they cost more than double, but it's also the time commitment of having these reservoirs and tanks offline. Luckily and conveniently at Reservoir 2, it was I won't call it a simple system, but it was a relatively truncated system to be able to manage. There were obviously challenges at Reservoir A water treatment plant in order to maintain level. However, it wasn't something that was insurmountable, clearly. If this had been at another tank site where potentially we didn't have as many options to maintain storage and to maintain the efficiency of the system, that would add additional difficulties to staff and potentially a lot of hours in order to maintain and to keep service going. So a lot of this has to be looked at not just from the standpoint of the hard costs, which clearly we can see, but it's also the soft costs that go into us operating the system and maintaining it as we go down the line. Next slide, please. So in the same breath, bolted steel storage tanks, we have 2 fiberglass lined, and I'll get into that in a little bit, and 6 epoxy lined and coated tanks. The advertised service life is about 40 years, and historically we haven't seen that. Outingdale is a primary example, Swansboro for that matter, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, as well as Rancho del Sol. That tank as well, all well under the 40 years and a lot closer to 25 years of advertised life cycle. That structure cannot be recoated. That's one of the main topics I want to make sure we kind of get through today. Those tanks are really relatively, they're a one and done. You can do some repairs to them, which we were able to do at Swansboro, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's such thin steel from the original construction of those tanks that removing that coating really isn't possible. Quite often when you go to remove the coating on any of those that's not coated from the factory, if you do a on-site coating, you can actually burn a hole in the tank just removing it to prep it. Additionally, with all the bolt locations that go through on every one of those panels, on every one of those staves, all just the same as the I-beam across the roof, just the same between those two panels. The coating is the only thing you have. So really, the only way to recoat those would be to actually disassemble the tank, blast, and completely clean it in an effort to minimize that corrosion, which really isn't feasible. In line with the rest of the system, we do continue to do dive inspections and cleanings every 5 years. Next slide, please. So one thing that was really spoke volumes to me about this slide, and the reason I kept it from the old Outingdale lower tank conversation, is the C-channel. So I've been talking about I-beams in the welded storage tank. That's all a composite structure as well. That plays itself just the same as the bolted tanks do in the way that they load shed and all the structural components work together. The C-channel is a much more cost-effective approach. However, it's not a very strong and sturdy approach long-term. It's subject to a lot more external corrosion due to the challenges with the way that the C-channel is actually adhered to the structure, as well as the way that the roof is going to move on that structure as well. So the real antithesis of this side is just to say that corrosion is going to occur in bolted steel or welded steel no matter what we do. It's really just a coating effort that we're after with all of these. Next slide, please. And this one, as some of the board may remember, you know, that just to the right of the center of that structure there, that's not a fifth support member. That's actually one of the roof supports that's fallen into the tank itself in Outingdale. And that's part of the struggle with the C-channel, is it just does not have the structural integrity the way that you would see in a welded steel tank. Next slide, please. And with that, as I kind of mentioned, it's a one and done structure. There was really no repairing financially, cost effectively, I should say, to extend the life of the Outingdale structure. Therefore, a full replacement was required at that site. Next slide, please. And to pivot a little, Swansboro Tank subsequently also had a C-channel roof rafter that did fail as well there and fall down. Next slide, please. However, a little bit different. We were able to actually get to this tank in time to actually repair just the top stave, just that top section there. We actually did a full replacement as well as the roof. And with that structure, that was at that time, was around a 20 to 25 year structure at that time. We're anticipating to get another 15 years out of it, so we're still only going to get to 35 of those prescribed 40 years that comes from the tank manufacturers. Even with that time frame and that replacement that we did, there's still a lot of, as you can see, the bottom two staves are still there with their original coating, and those are still going to continue to be the largest challenge that we have. Is that's where our leaks are going to occur. That's where the welding is going to occur to maintain that tank going forward. However, that is the most cost-effective way to kind of keep that structure in service, and it was an option at that time, and it wasn't a full replacement. Next slide. So I spoke a little bit about fiberglass lined. So the difference between fiberglass lined and really epoxy lined is just that you have a fiberglass liner inside the tank. It's actually fused to the steel shell. That's all that it is, and it actually does go through the bolt holes itself. So it's actually got fiberglass in between the panels. That's great in terms of corrosion. However, it does present a different challenge, which is kind of shown in the photo right there. It does still require a significant amount of maintenance in an effort to mitigate any potential for leaks. So we still have to coat every one of those bolts as well as every seam, because with that fiberglass, it's not a perfect closed structure. So there is a gasket there, but it's not a guarantee that in time it's not going to leak. So there's a relatively routine effort in recoating each one of these bolts and these seams to maintain the life of this tank. The glass, they call it glass diffused, it's a fiberglass lined. The whole premise of this was to elongate the life cycle of the replacement of these tanks. That does come obviously at a cost with the repair and the maintenance side of it as well. This does have an aluminum dome on it, so that part is excellent. This is obviously up at Strawberry, so it's got a significant snow load that was included in the original construction of the tank. However, the maintenance side of it is pretty extraordinary. Depending on the volume of leaks that we have and calling out a third-party vendor to come in to coat all this for us and really to put the caulking on there, it's quite a challenge in order to get the leaks to stop, to be honest. And I think that the idea of fiberglass is great, but the actual application of it still isn't there yet, unfortunately. This was installed in 1993. We have one that was installed around 2005. It's subject to the exact same leaks that we're still seeing today on both. Next slide, please. So Hypalon storage reservoirs, we do have 7 of these. These are the floating covers. They range in age from 31 to 34 years, and they're far beyond their design service life. So each one of them was subsequently put in somewhat different phases. So they were grouped together, 2 different groups. And each one of them had different materials that were selected in terms of the thickness and the actual UV resistance that was installed back in that time frame. So some of them are performing better than others. However, the overwhelming majority do have a significant O&M maintenance side of things that is very challenging. So with the floating cover operations maintenance manual that we had to put together for the Division of Drinking Water to continue to maintain and operate these, it really limited us to the operation of these reservoirs. You know, with any major fluctuations, you risk the option for, or the ability to tear the cover, excuse me. And so one of the things that we do is we do have a tendency to keep these reservoirs a lot more full than we would a normal welded tank, bolted tank, that kind of structure, which adds to the water quality challenge side of things with actually maintaining water age and so on. So these are really, they're very difficult to operate in the sense that you have a very limited window to operate them in. Obviously, in an emergency condition, you're going to use the water. However, on a day-to-day operation, you're really shortening up your operational characteristics for them. That, as part of that operations manual, the cover is cleaned 2 times a year, and with that comes extensive repair costs. Between those 7 reservoirs, we're averaging 10 repairs, and the annual cost is right around $200,000 to keep those in service. The repairs sometimes are internal, inside the liner, which those are very challenging to find. That requires a dye test, a diver, keeping it all in service, trying to find where that leak is, unless there's a really egregious tear that you can see from the dive. Consequently, the floating cover as well, as those cleanings go on, more and more leaks show themselves during that time as well. Obviously, those guys, the crews doing the work on them as well doesn't help, but it's also finding them by actually laying eyes on them twice a year. We do have a dive inspection that's performed annually, and we do a cleaning internally every 5 years. Next slide, please. So Reservoir 1, this photo was taken back in 2017. This is part of the water treatment process, just to give you a little bit of background. So coming out of the filters, the water comes across Gilmore Road and into the Reservoir 1. It's a clear well as well as a storage reservoir for the district. With this Hypalon cover, it's well beyond its life cycle. In fact, this is probably the worst plagued one that we have at the district. It is in the CIP, which I'll get into a little bit later. These leaks, and much like this one is shown here, this is October 13th, and it has not rained all summer, just to give you kind of a reference there. So those are the kind of leaks that we experience externally on these, on the top of the floating cover. And that requires actually, some cases, it does require a diver to go in and to patch it from the inside, depending on the severity of the leak. Next slide, please. And Reservoir 11, so this is actually multiple weeks after a storm. In fact, this was after the last storms, the major storms that we had this in January. This was towards the end of the month. And one of the things I wanted to note here, those aren't leaks, that's actually ponding of water from the rain. So the other struggle that we have with the Hypalon covers is actually getting the rainwater off. So in the higher elevations, we struggle with whatever pumps or siphons that we have to get the water off. They plug with pine needles. In the lower elevations, we have trouble actually getting the water into the troughs. That's just by design. And so the troughs are actually shown there, and they kind of act like a gutter on a roadway where they concentrate the water to a location where you can remove it. Well, that water, as you can see, didn't get its way into the trough. You can see kind of just a couple locations there where the water's just sitting on top, and obviously adding more and more challenges to these floating covers. Next slide. So concrete tanks and reservoirs. So we have 5 concrete tank storage units. So we have 2 tanks, 1 reservoir, and 2 water treatment plant clear wells. They range in age from 18 to 34 years and have had minimal maintenance costs since their original installation. The vast majority of it has been preventative crack sealing and minor crack sealing on some of the clear wells. We do dive and inspect every 5 years on these as well. Next slide, please. So Reservoir A, a little difficult to see with the snow, obviously, but we actually did a preventative coating on top of this one for crack sealing, so we actually sealed up all the external of that concrete in a very cost-effective way. We did it in-house. So it was a small construction project over a couple of weeks. It's time permitted, and we actually completed that in-house without any sort of bidding, that kind of thing. Very manageable from the crack sealing perspective at Reservoir A. Next slide, please. And Reservoir 12, so Reservoir 12 is kind of a different structure altogether. It's a pre-stressed, which I'll get into in a couple slides here, a structure that is really kind of the future for El Dorado Irrigation District. These structures are pre-stressed during construction, so they actually hold the concrete to itself. And then the roof actually has that gravel laid across the top of it. That's just really an energy dissipator for that structure to help mitigate during rain events. And with that structure, and one of the main reasons that this is, obviously being Reservoir 12 Cameron Park, one of the main benefits here is we were able to bury the structure right back. They don't have to be buried. In fact, the one I'll show you a little bit later is an open structure, just like any tank that you would see today at the district, welded steel or bolted. These really do a great job of kind of interconnecting all the, if you want to call it futuristic avenues that we have with concrete and rebar in an effort to kind of meld it together to make really an impermeable structure that will last well over 100 years. Next slide, please. So part of the cost challenges that we've had, not just with the initial construction side of things, but also with the welded costs, kind of get lost in the wind a little bit. And so I kind of broke down on this slide to show the initial cost of pre-stressed tanks is slightly more than the welded storage tank. But as you can see with the 15-year recoating window and the cumulative cost at the bottom, it's substantially more by completing those recoats. And that recoating is all based off the most recent Bass Lake tank recoating project per million gallons. And then that only has a 1% multiplier compounded annually through those 75 years to kind of give just an estimate for where we think coating is going to go going forward. Those aren't obviously hard costs. Those are anticipated costs. These don't include any of the site grading or any of the other small ancillary pieces of the project that need to get done in order to replace or upgrade these facilities. However, if you just look at the structure itself and see the external costs from just recoating, it is very, very expensive long term. Years ago, and back when the district initially constructed a lot of these welded storage units, we were really kind of pushed that direction really from cost, because at that time, pre-stressed concrete really hadn't kind of turned the corner yet. In 2005, we did Bass Lake tanks, we did Reservoir 12 to A and B, and at that time, that cost was substantially more than what we had paid to do really any of the welded tanks at that time. But going forward, especially with the cost difference that's come down substantially with the pre-stressed tanks, that's the direction that we're advocating to go when necessary. Next slide, please. And the pre-stressed tanks, we had an opportunity to go down to Roseville and to review 2 new tanks that they are installing down there and actually are complete. This is actually almost exactly a year ago. So the photo on the left, just for reference, that actually is the pre-tensioning structure that's there, the red and white. That's actually pulling that rebar shown on the right there around, and it's really not even 3/8 thick rebar that's going around there. And they pre-tension that and they tie it off in each one of those sections that you can see where the square cutout is on the right-hand side. That's where it's tied to itself there to actually hold the structural integrity. And then at the completion of that tensioning, they'll actually put a concrete external coating over that rebar. So that concrete is monolithically poured internally. So there's no cold joints within that concrete. It's a continuous pour. With that rebar being tensioned on the outside to provide that tensioning, it actually adds as a secondary source to make that composite unit. It really makes it almost, I don't want to call it a bulletproof, but a very strong unit that is not going to be subject to the challenges that we're having by way of the welded steel or any of that. The recoating for these is very minimal, if ever, depending on the construction of it. Additionally, with that composite structure and that monolithic pour, leaking is very minimal. So years ago with concrete, that was always kind of the knock on concrete was eventually it's going to leak, eventually it's going to leak. With the monolithic pour, that base, that foundation for that pre-stressed structure is actually cast into the sides. So that's all one unit. If there's ever a leak, it's actually designed to leak where that footing is, where the pre-tensioner is going around. There are weep locations within the structure. So between the rebar and the concrete, there's actually weep holes to allow that to come out. In the event that that ever occurs, it's actually a Sikaflex jetting water goes away. It's basically patching a hole just like we do with our canals. Very similar in the sense that that concrete is a composite structure, as I've been mentioning. That structure itself helps to self-yield in some ways. So as a seismic event occurs and anything of that nature, it will actually self-heal in the effect that there won't be any movement that causes it to actually occur, in the sense that we think of like a welded steel or even a bolted steel tank. With any sort of seismic event, they're going to move with the water. These are going to remain rigid in that time frame because of that composite structure. They are substantially, in this case, so I believe these were they might have been two 5 million gallon reservoirs. They are a little bit taller in terms of that structure, but that's for the sloshing factor that goes on. In the event that it's full and there's a seismic event, it's the ability that water has somewhere to go and doesn't actually break itself apart internally. So as part of the capital improvement timeline, just looking back, so I mentioned Rancho del Sol, that ended up being a bolted steel tank that required a complete new structure to be installed. Reservoir 3 we spoke about with the aluminum dome, Outingdale as well with the full replacement, Swansboro with the repair. In 2021, we didn't have a plan to replace the roof at Reservoir 2, but obviously we had to move forward with that decision due to the degradation that we found there. And kind of the future is shown as Reservoir 1, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, Reservoir 6, which I haven't talked much about, and Monte Vista Tank as well in 2026. Reservoir 6 has its own fair share of challenges. It was part of that grouping of 2000-2006 original construction of welded steel tank. It's been exposed to a lot of challenges with initial construction methods that were used there, as well as coating. That structure may not be savable depending on some additional review of that structure. It's likely that may have to be fully replaced depending on costs, which we'll come back with later. Next slide. So one of the challenges that we have is that the best laid plans don't always come to fruition, and this is one of them. Reservoir 4, as you may note from the last slide, wasn't even in that consideration at all. This is a tank dive that was performed actually January 13th, I believe, where they went into the structure and they found the failure of the roof. And one of the most concerning parts of this coating delamination that you can see just off in the distance in the far back of the photo is, down a little bit, Jen, a little bit more, a little bit more. My turn? Sorry. I'll give it back. It's actually right here. So as you can see, it's kind of an evenly distributed failure point for that corrosion. And the real reason that that's concerning is that that's where the roof structure actually meets for the welded shell on the outside. So that's where the load's displaced from the steel structure. If you remember, the photos of Reservoir 3, I didn't have a great one showing that, but that was a very similar failure mode that we had in Reservoir 3, where it required the replacement of that top stave, that top section to be replaced with that aluminum dome. We're very much potentially looking at Reservoir 4. We will regroup this August, obviously. We'll do a complete review of all of our tanks and see if there's the ability to move this up to try to mitigate that challenge of not having a full replacement need, but to potentially catch that beforehand. Obviously, that's going to require some moving of items and an adjustment in order to adhere to that kind of schedule. But that's part of the challenge that we have, is not just the funding, but also the staff resources to be able to complete that project. You know, this is very much going to be a one-off project from the standpoint of if we do move forward with an aluminum dome here and it's acceptable for it. It's a very detailed project and design-wise as well. So in conclusion, you know, each material comes with its own challenges. Obviously, there's costs associated with it, amongst all others. Staff is going to continue to evaluate all factors going forward. You know, and along with the mission statement and guiding principles, you know, we're maintaining service and meeting regulatory standards. And we'll propose, you know, full replacement or partial replacement when necessary, you know, depending on the structure and the condition that they're in. And that'll obviously be on a case-by-case basis. With continued deferral of maintenance, there's additional costs for repair, and obviously, as mentioned, full replacement depending on the structure itself. And the proactive approach towards projects is the direction that the district wants to go. You know, this requires sustained, you know, annual investment in order to recoat these tanks to mitigate that challenge, so that we're not replacing full roofs, that we're not jumping, head over heels into a project that we really didn't need to. Something of a recoating project and maintain it for 15 years is a much more viable approach. Well, with that comes financial needs integrated with the cost service study that will be taking place. That way we can balance service reliability and rate affordability going forward. Not asking it for all at once, obviously, as I mentioned. With those 16 tanks, we're gonna have to figure out a creative way to kind of space that out and mitigate those challenges. But there's more to it. It's maintaining that going forward and that same annual investment in order to complete that work. Are there any questions?
Wow. Yep.
I got it.
Director Osborne.
When we have to take the system offline to redo the tanks, what's the construction time for the bolted tank versus the pre-stressed concrete tank? Is it a substantial difference, or?
Director Osborne, did you mean the welded steel? Just-
Welded, yeah, yeah.
Okay. So the concrete tank, that particular tank in Roseville, so all of it kind of falls back into the line of the foundation that's originally there, and the soil from the geotechnical analysis was originally performed when the original tank was constructed. That's really going to lead into the duration. So if we have to do over excavation, for example, for a concrete tank,
Concrete tank, yeah.
yeah, then that's going to obviously add costs associated with that project. However, mitigatable over the lifespan of that structure. The recoating window traditionally for a welded steel tank without any structural repair is about 8 months. Sometimes it's closer to a year depending on size. Anytime we have to do any structural, we're obviously well over a year at that point, and that's when it gets to be even more challenging on the system.
So the construction time, is it a substantial difference in between the two?
Yeah, because you're going to still have to remove the old structure as well, so you're going to
Right.
have to elongate that time. However, the soft costs long-term are going to be much less.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Obviously, so that's just it.
Any other questions? Yes, Director Dwyer.
Patrick, you sold me on the concrete tanks. It was an easy sell. I mean, the numbers are obvious. That I think we and perhaps the district in the past has made the mistake of going cheap now and then paying for it over the long term in what you call the cost of ownership. And I think one example was, I recall several years ago, a discussion about the tank at Outingdale. Should we have a welded tank or should we have a bolted tank? The board at that time chose to go with the cheaper bolted tank option, and now we're gonna get to replace it again before its estimated useful life is over. So I think the lesson for the board is, if we're gonna do this, let's do it right. It serves our ratepayers the best in the long run. It's a little painful up front as we are playing catch-up to try to get to that interval, whatever the specified interval is, 15 years or forever in a concrete tank. Right. So I think that's a lesson for the board, is keep that in mind. Yeah, it might cost us more now, but it's going to save our ratepayers in the long run.
Right.
Yes, Director Anzini.
Yeah, not to go over what Director Dwyer just said, but it's really, I think, and maybe I'm just harping about the long run of infrastructure money that's available and how we can make it more impactful. There definitely is, after talking to other mountain county water agencies, there's definitely a resource that, in a joint compound, that we could lobby, as we're sending our president to Washington, D.C., we can lobby and maybe work on our elected officials that represent and come up with the funding, that this is really, really important, and we've got to really pay attention to the grants, because infrastructure is all part of that money supply, and it's really important to have, and I think I said this before, if you have the plan right on the shelf, take it and just apply, and we have to continue to apply, even to the point that if we have no one who can keep up with it, perhaps hiring an outside grant writer that could temporarily help us. And that's sometimes worth the investment to have somebody write those plans and keep applying. Because now is the time to do it. And it's, you know, eventually the trough is going to dry up. So, enough of my 3 cents.
Good point. 3 cents today, inflation. Any further comments, questions? Any public input relevant to this item? Seeing none in the audience. Jen, anybody online want to talk about it?
If you'd like to, if members of the public would like to address the board on information item number 5, now is your time. President Camp, it does not appear there are any members of the public wishing to speak.
All right, thank you very much, Patrick.
Actually, we have one additional comment from staff member.
I just wanted to briefly just thank Patrick. This is obviously a combination of engineering and operations type presentation, but Patrick did a lot of effort to work on this, and I guess it was probably one of our last-ditch efforts to keep Patrick the engineer versus Patrick the operations manager, but we appreciate it, and we'll keep, he's a great resource to have as we continue to work on our recoding and replacement projects as well, so.
Absolutely, great job, Patrick. Very in-depth presentation with a lot of information.
Thank you.
So even though Jen wanted to cut you off, I think.
No, that was the first time.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
This item was appropriately agendized.
And it, again, was an information item only with no action. Item 6, operations engineering, Dan Corcoran. Again, another informational item. Dan?
Good morning, and for fear of further going awry from Ms. Jennifer, I'm
Yeah, the
I'm always
over-under
very
on this
happy to
one is
see
getting low.
Kaylee learning on a day-to-day basis sitting next to Patrick, and she is our next tank replacement specialist engineer, so hopefully. Okay, so I'm here this morning just to give a brief overview per the board's request on our 2022 water transfer proposals and actual implementation and what that meant to the district. Next slide, please. So the 3 relevant board actions to today's discussion. First, in May of 2020, the board approved its 3rd water transfer agreement, which ended up being the most successful to date, primarily based upon hydrology that year, wherein we were able to transfer 8,000 acre-feet. And then in January of this year, as Brian had described, as staff was continuing to recover from the Caldor fire, bring the canal online, in recognition that we were going to begin saving or conserving that water through the main ditch project, the board adopted its resolution of its intent to retain control of those water rights. And then finally, in June of, last year, the board approved its most recent water transfer agreements. Next slide, please. And I've already discussed, that's why I'm here, because you asked me to be here. Next slide. Okay, quick, just water transfers as a whole, they're definitely a very valuable non-rate, but volatile revenue source. And obviously, as we discussed today, it'll become very evident why that's the case. But most importantly, we never propose a water transfer unless we can ensure we can meet our district's, our customers' demands, not only this year, but if drought conditions were to continue. And obviously, the board recalls in June of 2020 are a much different water supply condition than we were obviously now, and we were very cognizant of that when proposing that transfer. The district completed its first transfer in 2015 and has since conducted 3 more transfers. And most recently, in June of last year, up to about 2,500 acre-feet was proposed for transfer. Next slide, please. It just kind of went up for a sec. There it goes. Okay. So there are 2 sources. The first one, again, Weber Reservoir, which continues to be definitely a very beneficial water source for the purposes of water transfer. After staff analyzed the amount potentially available for transfer, what they determined was maybe up to 750 acre-feet. So each year we look at hydrology, we look at storage, spring conditions, and how much we think we can actually release from the reservoir that would not otherwise occur absent the transfer. So minimum releases, things like that that are already going downstream are not transferable. We also looked at our anticipated water supply needs and available supplies and determined that Weber Reservoir just clearly would not be necessary to meet our customers' needs last year's, notwithstanding the ongoing drought conditions, primarily because of the benefit, actually completely because of the benefits of having permit 21112 available at Folsom Reservoir. We know that this reservoir refills every year, so even if we did transfer it, because it's so undersized for the amount of the watershed, and we can see obviously that occurring now, that we know that for sure that it would refill even if we did transfer that water. But as I said, the actual amount that would be transferred in the end was really subject to hydrology and what actually occurs, as well as toward the regulatory timelines. All right, next slide. I could tell you're pushing me along, so thank you. So, and then the second source is conserved water transfers. And this is the number that Director Anzini talked about, the 1,800 acre feet, and that's really an average of historical performance of the ditch from, I believe it was 2009 to 16. But as we look and also at the current year hydrology, knowing, as Brian said, we wouldn't be online the first part of the year, maybe save up to about 1,800 acre feet. We always propose a maximum. We don't want to leave water on the table that could have been transferred. As Brian described, the actual amount conserved last year was about, I think, 1,100. But nevertheless, that was the genesis of that number. We weren't able to use that water. We didn't need that water, and it turns out, we can't use it down at Folsom Reservoir. This particular pre-14 water right is not available downstream. So it was just water that would not otherwise be able to go to the district's benefit. This also was actually the first time that this potential source of water could be available because obviously having the pipeline successfully completed. But there's one significant hurdle to go over, and that is achieving consensus on the methodology. We feel convicted and strong in our calculations and amount of water that's actually served. Nevertheless, the water having to go through reclamation facilities, they have to be in agreement with the actual amount of water. And that process continues, as I'll describe going forward. Next slide. As a recap of what we actually transferred, just under 600 acre feet after we take out our various deductions for losses, et cetera, that came in. All of that water last year was only provided by Weber Reservoir. Unfortunately, we weren't able to transfer any conserved water. There's a couple challenges. Obviously, we were later than we typically were last year because we were benefited by those late spring storms, as you recall. And so we weren't in a position early in the year to go out to market to start the typical processes that our great environmental review folks start early in the spring. So we started a little later. But really the main challenge was that methodology. I can say it's fortunate that we continue to have Westlands be a partner and help advocate with us for this process. And we did actually have the district and reclamation had a very successful meeting last month. So we're continuing to pursue with the hope and expectation if there is capacity to transfer water this year, hopefully we're maintaining the course, and our goal is to try to transfer water this year in the event that there is the ability to do so. Next slide, please. So overall, not too bad, honestly. Almost $500,000 in non-rate revenue that came to the district from water that would have spilled on New Year's Eve. So remember that water, a reservoir would have filled up, it would have just spilled last year, would have went right down through Folsom and out to the Delta. So it really just shows the importance and the strategy, if we can do this right, if we release water at the right time, how it could be beneficial to us, beneficial to the buyers, and in this case, beneficial to reclamation. They obviously didn't waste that water, went through their generators as well, rather than spilling it the next winter.
And beneficial to the ratepayers.
Right, and most importantly. Thank you. Next slide, please. There's one major challenge with our reservoir reoperation transfers, and these are we term refill agreements. And basically, Reclamation and Department of Water Resources hold the key to the gates, right? So we have to go through their facilities in order to transfer this water to our proposed buyers. Depending upon the year, whether or not it goes to the state or federal water projects, they have to be convinced that that available capacity, that hole, if you will, in the reservoir will be refilled at a time that it doesn't impact their reservoirs. Obviously, last year, they were very concerned about the ability to refill this year. Fortunately, Mother Nature has helped us along. We were successful in having, once again, reasonable agreements. We always think that they're definitely very protective of this, the DWR's and Reclamation's interests, but there were conditions that we felt we were comfortable in agreeing to in order to complete those transfers. Next slide. So you notice how I only described Weber Reservoir last year, and that's because, unfortunately, after the 2020 transfer, we were definitely able to meet our own customers' needs, but we weren't quite able, because of that subsequent year hydrology in 21 and 22, to really eliminate our refill debt, to kind of pay back and fill that at a time, because all of the entire Sacramento-San Joaquin watershed very constrained in the amount of refill. So we were able to refill enough to meet our needs, but we still carried that refill reservation of over 7,000 acre feet from that prior transfer for 2 consecutive years. Not ideal, but that's sort of the rules of the game, and we felt comfortable being able to do that and still meet our customers' needs. Which obviously preclude us from proposing, we don't want to make a larger hole in our reservoir, because then we wouldn't be able to meet our own customers' needs. Next slide, please. Obviously, things change very rapidly in about a week or a week and a half. And we were able to completely eliminate this entire refill reservation. No one needs to be reminded of our New Year's storms. But so we're once again have the ability to market these supplies if there is available need and capacity through the state and federal projects in 2023. Right now, there may be enough project water. They don't have the ability to even move water if we did find a buyer, but nevertheless, we sort of reset the clock, if you will, and we're ready to start over when the strike when the iron's hot. Next slide. So even though 2021 was a very challenging year in many aspects, we were able to completely eliminate that refill obligation for all the 2020 transfer. So we were back in the market again last year and transferred that water. And then we then subsequently already eliminated that refill reservation as well. So we too, with this supply, are ready to market it when conditions are appropriate. So just a quick year in review. Obviously, the extreme hydrology, we went from drought to flood very quickly. So we hit both ends of the spectrum, but we were able to, constrain our ability to the amount we could transfer last year, but at the same time, it also helped us reset our refill obligations. And then also just, obviously the ongoing regulatory challenges that affect our ability to move that conserved water, but our staff continues to pursue that. And we're making incremental progress. Next slide, please. So no options today, and the picture that we leave you with is actually of, next slide, is Weber Reservoir. I think Director Anzini and Dwyer were able to go out and see. So this small little reservoir, little engine that could provide $500,000 in non-rate revenue to the district last year. So even though I'm doing the presentation today, I always want to take the opportunity to recognize Brian Deason, Elizabeth Leeper in the background are a lot of the legwork. I'd say almost all of the legwork to make this happen. So it's really always a team effort on these things. A lot that goes into it. So that's all I have.
Any questions for Dan? Comments?
Yes.
Dr. Dwyer?
Yeah, I guess the law of supply and demand, with the abundance of runoff that we've had since our events this year, what effect does that have on the overall price for our transferred water?
Yeah, it has 2 factors, the price and the actual availability. So we haven't seen any proposed cost schedules for this year yet. I would say I would anticipate to be lower than last year because simple supply and demand factors, more people be able to sell water this year than last year. But probably more constraining is the ability, when the state and federal projects, Central Valley Project, State Water Project were constructed, they weren't constructed for non-project water. So we take advantage of available capacity during low yield years. Based upon we've been in this 8 years, I guess now, it's kind of that 30, 40, maybe 50% of their available water, then they'll have available capacity for non-project transfers. We're getting close to that threshold. So we get a few more storms, it just might not even be possible. Even if someone did want to purchase water, we'd have to be able to get that water through. So we're obviously watching it very closely.
Dr. Anzini? Hang on, George.
Yeah, just a couple of remarks here, and it has to do with the supply that we're refreshed. But I want to compare us to much smaller water districts that are down the hill in Calaveras and Tuolumne. But these smaller water districts are having a real problem. We're fortunate because of our investment in all of our delivery system, that these smaller water districts have been asked to conserve the 30%, as is IED has been doing, for their customers to conserve the water in order to be able to make sure we're good for the next year. But the smaller water districts have been conserving it in the pipes And so now, when they let it go, they don't have the filtering systems that we have. Their water is coming out tainted. And that's because they've been holding the water, and now they have to spend extreme amount of money to filter the water and make it usable for their ratepayers. Of course, we are a mid-range water company compared to what they are, but we are blessed with all this snow, as they are, but they don't have the facilities to capture like we do. And, and another point is with the Westlands transfer, there's been a significant change in that board now. So that board is not as receptive to getting the water supply because they tend to be a little bit more progressive. And considering that the agricultural farms that are benefiting of the Westlands, there may be a little shift there going on. So I don't know where we're at, but we need to talk further about not conservation, but on how we collect our storage. And there are lots of opportunities I see in our future here, so.
Thank you, Director Anzini. Director Osborne.
More of a statement than a question, but last year I was concerned about the public's perception of us selling water in a drought. And I had a lot of people say, thank you for not voting sell the water. This year, I think the opposite is in effect, so have at it. Okay?
Problem with that is if you have at it, then they'll go somewhere else when they don't have at it, so.
Yeah.
Director Day.
Yeah, to George's point of when it's advantageous for us to sell, people misunderstand the process and don't want, and don't want us to, and now when there aren't advantages. So this might be a long-term on your notes, Jesse, of a short little article, kind of like the rumor control article and some of those others, of, why and when and how we sell water, and it doesn't impact or hurt our ratepayers, our ability to provide water to people, that it's just an enhanced source of revenue. And so just maybe polish something up to help them understand. And if we are able to sell water, down the road again, then I'd be ready and could pull it out and start putting it out there.
Yeah, good, very good point, Director Day. Yes, Director Osborne.
Initial sale in 2015, there was quite a few potential buyers that were because of drought conditions. And I always said that, I think Westlands, because they have a regulatory shortfall, will always be back, even though the price will fluctuate, what we're gonna get. But I was always in favor of just selling it to an agricultural endeavor to maintain the food supply. And so there was some other districts that would have paid us probably a couple $100 an acre foot more, but I thought Westlands would always be, because of their regulatory shortfall problems, always be a buyer.
Very good, thank you. Anything else for Dan? Any public input? Seeing none in the room, anybody online, please?
If members of the public would like to comment on information item number 6, please see the detailed instructions on page 2 of today's agenda. President Veerkamp, it does not appear there are any members of the public wishing to speak on information item number 6.
Thank you very much. That ends our informational items. Thank you, Dan. We are ready to go into our action items. Item 7, finance. Jamie?
No, this is the warrant registers. Will you be recusing yourself today?
I will be recusing
Okay,
myself,
then
yes.
Director Day can take over for
Item 7.
action item number 7.
Yeah, do I have a motion and a second?
I mentioned that we.
I'll second. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any board member questions? Are there any public comments or questions?
This is the time for public comment on action item number 7. Option 1, moved by Director Anzini and seconded by Director Dwyer. Vice President Day, it does not appear there are any members of the public wishing to speak. I believe we're ready for the vote.
All right, President Veerkamp will be recusing himself. Others, please vote.
Can you just state for the record that you'll be recusing yourself, Director Veerkamp?
Yes, I will be recusing myself from the vote on this item.
Division 1, 2, 4, and 5, voting aye, motion carries unanimously.
All right. Thank you, Vice President Day, for filling in. We got item 8 now, operations. Mr. Russell. Oh, it's like. You're going to earn your keep today. Yeah, Patrick's back.
Gonna have to.
Welcome again, Patrick.
Thank you. You're not tired of me yet, right?
No.
Okay, good. Good to know, Jim. Good morning. Drinking Water Operations Manager Patrick Wilson, presenting today on the Drinking Water Construction Service Line Replacement Project funding request. Next slide, please. So in previous board actions, the board has approved construction funding for in-house staff to perform the replacement of much-needed service lines on the system, as well as February of last year with Joe Vicini for patch paving. And then subsequently in November of this year, the board adopted the 2023 through 2027 capital improvement plan, which included this project. Next slide, please. So just an overview of the service lines. We have 44,310 water service lines. The crew replaced 577 lines in 2022. The leak rate still continues to far exceed the national average, which you'll see in a future slide in terms of the increase, because the number of service line failures is continuing to increase for that matter. Right now we have 26,732 poly service lines in the system. They're failing within about a 15 to 30 year service life on average. So the objectives are to reduce the failure rate below the national average with proactive replacement, and we'll get to that in the next slide. And we're replacing these with polyethylene services with copper service tubing. So as you can see from this chart, from 2020 was the initial startup of the crew. From that time, the unplanned has continued to grow, and including last year in 2022. Still manageable, obviously, by in-house staff. However, the goal is obviously to have the plan be 2/3 as opposed to the 1/3, especially from the cost perspective of doing the unplanned and the restoration and so on with the notification process. This project does include a 5-year CIP of a little over $23 million, and this year we have a CIP budget approved of $4.25 million. Next slide. So some of the challenges that we've been experiencing. So the current leak response requirements, obviously those have continued to increase with the unplanned unplanned full replacement services, as well as staffing challenges we've had, due to attrition from everything from, getting promotions to retirements to leaving the division altogether, leaving the district for that matter. So we have 14 of the 27 within construction that are within 1 year of employment still to this day. This project requires detailed training. It's not the standard replacement, obviously, as you would anticipate from a repair. There's a lot of planning that goes into it, everything from customer notification to material handling and so on, and really planning a day-to-day operation. These guys are basically, they're foremen, if anything, for what major construction crews would be outside of the district. So the planning that goes alongside of that does take very detailed training and it has to be very methodical in order to be efficient, obviously, from that standpoint. So our community outreach, we're still continuing at Stonegate Village. We've sent additional letters to them as well, directing homeowners to the scope of the project, impact to customers, project details, and this is also on the website as well. And the project manager contact information is available. We do continue to do the advisory signage and when they're entering the community, and we do door-to-door notifications. Even on service interruptions, we're still continuing to do that as well, even with this continued notification process that we're doing. So as you may remember from last year, but a lot of the challenges that we're faced with these service line replacements is actually other utilities. As you can see here, much like El Dorado Hills, where Stonegate there's all sorts of utilities from buried gas to telecoms and power even for that effect. And a lot of that challenge, we are still required to lay eyes on all those USAs, and we're still utilizing the VACONs to do so to mitigate any potential line strikes, obviously. And with that, once we have verification of where that service is, next slide, please. On the utility conflict, we can open trench in the situation where it's needed. Ideally, we're pulling a service through when we can through that poly. So we're pulling new copper service tubing from the main up to the meter. However, when that's not possible due to utility conflict, in this particular case, we'll actually bed it and backfill. So the utility conflict is underneath us. We'll lay the new service line, and then subsequently we'll do the paving and then final concrete restoration at the end once paving's complete. So funding breakdown. So the capitalized labor, we're looking for a little over 2.1 million. Asphalt patch paving, about $869,000. Material and supplies, that includes the copper service tubing, all the fittings, everything necessary to make those connections at 537,000 change. Sand and gravel for backfill, 343,000 and change. Compaction testing and county inspections. So as part of our aggregate-based backfill within the county right-of-way, we are required to take compaction testing. We do have a third-party vendor that we do hire out of our on-call list to come in and do that compaction testing, and then subsequently coordination with the county as well with those results. And then finally, any locations needing concrete remediation services, about $286,000, totaling the $4.25 million CIP budgeted request. Next slide. And board option to option 1, authorized funding in the amount of $2,109,000 for capitalized labor, $869,358 for asphalt patch paving, $537,346 for materials and supplies, $343,672 for sand and gravel, $104,038 for compaction testing and El Dorado County inspections, and $286,586 for concrete remediation services for a total funding request of $4.25 million for the service line replacement project. Option 1.
Any questions of Patrick? Do we have a motion?
I'll move option 1 with a question.
Okay, and do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Second by Director Anzini, yes.
Patrick, we were doing okay in '21. To what do you attribute the real decline in the planned replacement as opposed to the unplanned? Was it you mentioned staffing issues, is that the real driver?
That's the real driver. I think we have seen a slight uptick as well. That shouldn't be underscored here in terms of the unplanned, the failures as well. Because even shutting down Stonegate with the attrition of staff leaving and having to change over that whole group, obviously with 14 of the 27, restarting that whole project itself this year, we still have seen a lot of service line failures that are increasing. And really it's just that poly aging out. And a lot of the same subdivisions that we kind of see that we're seeing targeted spots to move forward with going forward into the next coming years with areas where we know we're going to head towards really because of those unplanned repairs. It's really giving us a clearer view.
Thank you. That clears it up that we've had an increase in the unplanned, so we have to pull our crews off of the plan to take care of that.
Right.
One last question. I think there was a class action suit against the supplier of the poly pipes. Any update on that, or is that going to just churn through the courts forever?
President Dwyer, are you referring to the JM Eagle litigation? Yeah. So this is a lawsuit that the district has been involved in for a long, long time, as reflected in the many agendas in which we discussed this in closed session, which we appropriately agendized. To sum it up, there has been no real activity to report on outside of the memoranda that I provide to the board on a quarterly basis.
Any other questions? Do we have a motion? Yes.
Just a burr in my saddle. We pay the county for inspections, and our people are the experts in this. Why are we having to pay the county to come out and say, "Oh, that looks good"? It just aggravates me. But I guess it is what it is.
You're correct, Director Osborne.
Director Ranzini sent the 3 cents back to you, George, as well, for that comment. All right, we have a motion and a second. Anybody online relevant to the item, Jim?
This is for any public comment on action item number 8. Option 1 moved by Director Dwyer and seconded by Director Anzini. President Vierkamp, it does not appear there are any members of the public wishing to speak. I believe we're ready for the vote.
All right, please vote.
Division 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, voting aye, motion carries unanimously.
Thank you, Patrick. Item 9, engineering, Mr. Money, please. Good morning.
Morning.
Nice tie, by the way, family tie, I'm assuming, yep.
This is a birthday present over the weekend, so
Very nice.
had to get some good use out of it.
Yeah, very nice.
So good morning again, John Money, Senior Civil Engineer for the district, here this morning to discuss a contract amendment for additional engineering services for our Sly Park Intertie Improvements Project. Again, we've been to the board a couple times on this regarding this project. Back in November or December of last year, we came and we're here for grant authorization that we were ultimately successful for. Followed by an initial request for engineering contract in February. This was included in the last approved CIP in November of last year, and then just in this last board meeting, we asked for another contract amendment for easement acquisition services to facilitate the construction of this project. So again, just a brief summary of why we are here today. The design of the Sly Park Intertie is underway. This morning we're discussing a few additional changes to the project scope or potential changes to the project scope. The first two of these include additional pipeline sections after we've analyzed the pipeline after the basic design report. The third is PG&E power coordination and design of backup generators for the proposed pump station at Reservoir A. And then the third is additional design for additional points of connection at Reservoir A for operations. Go. Next slide. Oh, yeah, that one. That's the one I was looking for. Oh, no, sorry, I skipped over one. You're right, Jen. So again, just some additional background. Let me gather my thoughts there. Sly Park Intertie was originally constructed in 1976 for the drought. Again, the pipeline end to end originally was about 4 miles of steel pipe. That steel pipe is a non-standard pipe without an interior lining and a failed exterior lining as well. And we've had substantial leaks, so the majority of the pipeline has been taken offline. I'll add that just because we haven't taken it all offline does not mean that it hasn't failed. So next slide, please. So again, just as our system map, the segment in green right there is the Sly Park Intertie. And again, what we're really looking for is some resiliency and redundancy in our system, connecting the Reservoir 1 water treatment plant, Project 184, with the Reservoir A water treatment plant, tied to Jenkinson Lake. So again, this is a little bit of a blown up detail of the pipeline. The first two segments we're going to discuss are right there. So you see that start of replacement on the north end of that drawing. That segment north of that where that leader lands. And then on the bottom end, it's that little dog leg that goes off to the right. And that goes up to our current Sly Park Hills tank. So again, the first design segment we're asking for additional design dollars for is to complete the design of an alignment between Ridgeway and Sportsman's Pump Station. So you see that the segment in yellow is the existing, or a portion of the existing slide park, or slide park intertie that is still in service. And so initially, we were a little bit reluctant to include this in the project because it crosses Highway 50 and would likely really be expensive to replace that segment. It's kind of a substandard crossing on the south side of 50 there. It's almost a one-to-one slope coming down the hill. So just, we're talking some really expensive construction dollars to get this back in. Fortunately, during the basic design report, Waterworks came up with a good idea of relocating it into an undercrossing of Ridgeway Drive, shown in the blue line there. That would tie us into, I'll add one more in there. The light blue line is the existing Moose Hall transmission main. So we would tie into the Moose Hall transmission main, go under the freeway through the underpass, and then come back up on Pony Express. And really what that does is it provides us a fully accessible and maintainable pipeline easement moving forward. It also gets rid of, again, another failed section of the Slide Park intertie. That last little link between the Reservoir 1 and the Sportsman's Pump Station would likely be addressed as we start to make improvements at Reservoir 1. The second design segment we're looking at is from kind of the head of Reservoir A up to our Slide Park Hills tank. And so again, the segment in red is another portion of the Slide Park Hills intertie that's still in service. Again, this pipeline has had numerous instances of corrosion and multiple repairs the past year. On the right, there's two, actually as we were walking the project with our design engineer, these repairs were ongoing. And so in the top right picture, you can't quite see it because of the reflection of the trees, but there's two steel bands in that pool of water there with the Slide Park intertie buried in it. So they'd already dug that section up twice for repairs, and as we were there, the water was kind of just churning on the top as they were trying to isolate yet another couple of repairs. If you make an about face from that pool, there's another exposed joint, and you can see the pinholes that we're experiencing throughout, again, that pipe as it continues to degrade. It's important to note that this project was already previously identified by the district and is included in the current CIP. We're just looking for some efficiencies on both the design and on construction dollars on the back end. We've asked Waterworks to proposal to roll this into the larger project. The third consideration we're taking into account is that initially we weren't considering backup power for the new pump station that we're proposing at Reservoir A. So there is backup power at Reservoir A, but it's only enough really to run the station at this time. So under all circumstances, we're going to need backup power at the new pump station as well in case the reservoir is offline. There's also ongoing coordination efforts with PG&E to provide service to that new pump station. Their general policy is that they'll give you one service per parcel, and that really, we have multiple parcels that have multiple services. And so that's kind of a hassle going back and forth between us and PG&E and really finding a doable outcome on those parcels. So next slide, please. And then the third is we basically initially considered a point-to-point connection, Res 1 to Res A. As we got into the nuances of how the water treatment plant is operated and all the different scenarios where we can take the plant offline or the reservoir offline, we opted to include 2 additional points of connection, and that gives us the ability to isolate the Reservoir A, the actual reservoir, and then also use that for storage if we do have projects where we take Reservoir A completely off, or the Res A treatment plant completely offline. So in total, with those 4 design elements, we're looking at approximately another $370,000 in engineering costs for this project, which is what we're asking the board to approve today. Again, just kind of a summary, some of the design costs are offset by a $750 grant, or a $750,000 grant that $750 wouldn't go very far. With the County of El Dorado, once we move into construction, again, we were successful on securing that $10 million from the state DWR. The remainder of the funding is planned for a 2024 bond issuance. And then just by way of schedule, we are in the process of preparing the EIR. We will be meeting at the Pollock Pines Community Center actually on Wednesday of this week with the initial notice of that EIR and meeting with the residents that are in the impacted area. Moving to, so we plan the design and environmental to be complete basically by approximately the end of the year, early next year, with construction going on early 2024. So with that, option 1 is to approve a contract amendment with Waterworks Engineers in the not to exceed amount of $370,094 for the design of Sly Park intertie improvements and authorize additional funding for that same amount. Option 2 is to take other action as directed by the board, and option 3 is to take no action.
Move 1.
We have a motion.
I'll second.
We have a second. Questions or comments of Mr. Money? No? Anybody in the public wishing to address this item? Seeing none. Jen, anybody online wishing to address this item?
This is the time for any public comment on action item number 9. Option 1, moved by Director Osborne and seconded by Director Dwyer. President Veerkamp, it does not appear there are any members of the public wishing to speak on action item number 9. Okay, I'm just going to actually state the entire option for the record. Option 1, approve a contract amendment to Waterworks Engineers Incorporated in the not to exceed amount of $370,094 for the design of the Sly Park intertie improvements and authorize additional funding of $370,094 for the Sly Park intertie improvement projects, project number 21079. And for the record, there was a small administrative error on the agenda. The name of the company is Waterworks Engineers with an S.
Yes. All right, call for the vote.
Division 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, voting aye, motion carries unanimously.
Thank you very much. We are now to the closed session portion of our agenda. Any comments on closed session item A?
Thank you, President Veerkamp. The board will be meeting in closed session to discuss one matter, which is agendized today as closed session item A. I anticipate that the board's consideration of that item will require at least 20 minutes.
All right.
For the purposes of this Zoom meeting, it will be shut down and not reopened prior to 11:15. However, depending on how long the closed session takes, it may be longer.
All right, we've returned from closed session. Council, do we have anything to report?
President Veerkamp, the board met and deliberated with its property negotiators, but took no reportable action. And so that concludes my report out of closed session.
All right, very good.
We just
Review.
have one review of assignment. President Veerkamp requested that staff agendize the Diamond Springs, Maine repair and project plan, which is located in Shingle Springs, for a future board meeting.
Yeah. And I
I
think
just like to say Diamond Springs, Maine in Shingle Springs because people get
the
confused.
component of that was the secondary feed or potential for something to keep Ponderosa High School up and running, so, okay. With that, we are adjourned.
At 11:26 a.m.